been kind of puzzling over, thinking about this theme, living on the edge, since the beginning of the year, academic year, when I was invited to give this presentation. One way to think about edges, of course, is the various edges to which we are drawn or to which God calls us, the edges in our society, and there will be time and occasion to talk about that throughout this gathering. But I want to also think for a bit with you theologically about what it means to be on the edge, why we find that challenging or uncomfortable, what God beckons us toward at the edge, and to do that by doing what I think I was probably trained to do best right here, which is to look at our lives through the lens of Scripture and to put the scriptural stories beside our own stories. So I'm going to spend a little more time on one story and then wrap some others as well, and that's one of my very favorites, which is the story of Jonah and the whale. So I want to talk about Jonah, the whale, and a church on the edge. And maybe I should just call this some musings from a new president. Not that I don't entirely identify with the guy in the water. But I've had, I'd love to. Sometimes you're the windshield. Sometimes you're the bug. These really are musings. It's kind of my own sort of journey or thinking as a Lutheran theologian, as a theologian of the church. And so I'm going to test some ideas out here. I've done this a little bit. I've shared some thoughts with some groups, some folks, some friends. They haven't always wanted to call them just musings. Every once in a while, I've begun to kind of share where I think I'm heading theologically. And I get a puzzled stare, or sometimes it's not musings that they suggest I'm engaged in, but a little bit of heresy. So I don't know, maybe you'll be the judge of that. And I'm not myself sure at times. I think my own sense of faith journey continues to pull and tug and twist and turn, and the path isn't quite what I ever expected. I had a conversation about a year ago with one of my favorite professors, who was eager to have lunch because he'd heard stories about one of his favorite students and was gathered as we went through the conversation a little worried about some of the things I was writing and saying and going. So I'll let you decide that, but I figure, goodness gracious, if you can't take some risks about at a conference that's about living on the edge, then where can you? So my question to you really is, will you go along for a bit? Are you willing to risk a little heresy for a little while at least? And I just want to make sure you're serious about that because sometimes the penalty for heresy is steep. All right, so Jonah the whale and living on the edge, or leading a church on the edge. Before jumping to Jonah, just a first word about edges. I think our culture has regularly taught us that to be at the edge, that the edge is a place of danger. That it's uncomfortable, it's unusual, you might be called out, you might be singled out. That the edge is the place of scarcity, of fear, of danger, and therefore we have been urged constantly in our lives to stay near the center of power, the center of security, the center of privilege. Again and again, I think the larger culture urges us to tarry in the middle, to avoid moving beyond what we know. The question I want to ask is not only have we bought into that as the church, have we gotten a little too comfortable with the symbols of power that used to adorn our congregations or even the status we enjoyed as pastors? Have we gotten too accustomed to being at the center of culture and society? And I suspect so because I hear a lot of fretting, a lot of concern that we're in decline, that we're moving from the center of the culture to the margins. That we don't enjoy the same cultural status or privilege that we once did. And I understand that I have those same concerns about balancing budgets and churches staying open and all of the rest. And at the same time, it occurs to me that maybe if we're too much at the center and not at the edge or the margin, then maybe we're not really being faithful to the one who is so regularly at the edge and the margin and called his followers to be at the same place. So we have in the culture, and perhaps even in the church, been urged to stay at the center because the edge is a place of danger. But what if we were taught wrong? What if the edge isn't everything we were taught to fear? What then? And that's the kind of question I want to play with for the time to come. And I want to play with it particularly around and in light of the story of Jonah. The interesting thing about Jonah, of course, is that prophets don't usually disobey God. The paradigmatic is, who shall I send? Here am I, send me. Jonah hears the same call, here am I, send Isaiah. Or just about anyone other than me. And so he flees. And the question, of course, is why? What makes this prophet so unusually, uncharacteristically disobedient? And the answer, of course, has everything to do with, in fact, the balance of power at this time, because Nineveh, the place he was called to, was the capital of Assyria, Israel's mortal enemy. And the last thing he wanted was to imagine a message of mercy, of grace, of repentance coming from God to Israel's enemy. Jonah was the prophet of a king. This king, Scripture tells us, was not a good king, was not a holy king, not a righteous king, but this king was a powerful king. And Jonah knows who butters the bread that he has become accustomed to eating. And so he hears the word of the Lord to go to Nineveh, and he flees in the opposite direction. He flees, in short, because he doesn't think God should care about other nations. He wants Israel to remain at the center of God's attention, which for me suggests that perhaps Jonah's worldview is one of scarcity. That he is dominated by the conviction that there is not enough time, not enough resources, not even enough God to go around. And the challenge, of course, is that when you live out of a worldview of scarcity, when you think that there is not enough, then the only answer really is to hoard power, to hold on to all that you have, and to stay at the center of things, come hell or high water. When you think about it, I think Jonah is a very different story than we've been encouraged to read it or interpret it as. Jonah's story is not a conversion story. If you notice that, he never does come around. And nor is really the focus of the story on the conversion of Nineveh. When you think about it, it's kind of astounding that the whole of the length and breadth of the description of Jonah's crusade or campaign, evangelistic crusade through Nineveh, it's one sermon of one sentence repeated just a handful of times. 40 days more, and Nineveh will be no more. When you think about it, it is about the lamest sermon ever. And yet, even though it's this unbelievably repetitive, dull, offensive, boring sermon, yet the work God does through that is unbelievable, as the whole of the city is converted. The whole of the city recognizes its sinfulness, all the way from the king who wears sackcloth, and not just the king of Assyria. Here's this vagabond Israeli prophet and comes to his senses and decides to take on sackcloth and ashes and call everyone to fast, including the animals. I mean, when you think about it, maybe the whole whale thing is the easier part of the story to believe. Jonah is not a conversion story because he doesn't change. Jonah cannot, throughout the story, give up his worldview of scarcity. At the pinnacle moment, when Jonah flees the city after preaching the sermon that he is sure will not work, and it does, and then goes up on the hill to watch and see if God really will spare the people. And when God does, in fact, relent and God encounters Jonah, there's this phenomenal moment that reveals to the core Jonah's character as he answers God. And really, what does he do? He whines. That is why I fled to Tarshish at the beginning, for I knew you were a gracious God. I knew that you were merciful and slow to anger. I knew you were abounding in steadfast love and ready to relent from punishing. Jonah is a freaking whiner who from beginning to end will do anything he can to keep Israel at the center, to avoid the edge, and to keep God all for himself. Jonah is not a conversion story. Jonah is a tragicomedy. Jonah is, as Bob Robinson taught me when I was a student here 25 years ago, Jonah is the prophetess Schlemiel. Jonah is the countertype to the faithful prophet. His story is meant to be funny, to make us laugh, in order to draw us also to this heartbreaking realization how often, out of our own fear and insecurity, we will hold on to the center for everything. Jonah doesn't change. The question this tragicomedy raises is, will Israel? Right? The point of the story isn't Jonah or Nineveh, it's Israel. Will Israel change and give up its worldview of scarcity? Or even more so, as we continue to read it in the church, will we? Here's the thing. Our world is still dominated by the worldview of scarcity. We're dominated, that is, by the conviction that there is not enough. And just as much, our world is dominated by a worldview of inadequacy. You are not enough. The dominant and unrelenting testimony of the cultural messages that come at us thousands of times a day are precisely those two. You do not have enough, and you are not, finally, enough. And so what I want to think a little bit about, I want to shift gears from the stories of the Bible to the stories of our culture. And I want to spend a couple minutes talking about the world of marketing. In particular, I want to talk a bit about the development of the world of inadequacy marketing. And before going very far, I want to kind of tip my hand to the people who have been most instructive to me. Seth Godin, one of the top marketing communication gurus of the age, and Jonah Sachs, another marketer whose book Story Wars informs a lot of the conversation I'll have about marketing. What Godin and Sachs are both really clear about is that this kind of reality of our own world of marketing that is constantly seeking to create in us a sense of lack, right? That the goal of marketing today is to make you aware, even hyper-aware, of your own lack and inadequacy, to create in you a sense of need so that need can be filled by the product they're trying to sell you, that actually was not the dominant mode of marketing for most of the industrialized world or history. But it really got its start about 70 or 80 years ago, and it was started, innocently enough, by the Listerine Company. I don't know if you remember this, but there was a day when Listerine actually was sold and marketed as a medicinal product. It was something that you gargled to help you with a sore throat, to help you get over having a cold. And Listerine did a pretty steady trade along those lines for quite some time, but eventually their sales began to plateau, and in the marketing world, plateau equals death. And so they were commissioned with coming up with a new strategy, new approach. And what they came up with was no longer the idea of the medicinal value of Listerine, but instead they needed to create a new audience. They needed to imagine Listerine tending new needs that people, the market hadn't thought of before. And so they came up with this kind of brilliant campaign that was eventually called the Sad Edna campaign. The figure on the screen is, the ad is named Edna. And I don't know if you can read that, but the tagline across the advertisement, a full-page magazine advertisement, is often a bridesmaid, but never a bride. Right? Which immediately kind of, in terms of the way narrative works, it pulls the hearer, the reader, or the viewer in, because we immediately get curious. My goodness, how can someone that comely, that lovely, that young, never be a bride? So when you read the small print, what you discover is that Edna has a problem. Edna has a medical condition that heretofore had been unknown to the American public called halitosis. Edna has bad breath. And because of that, she is often a bridesmaid, but never a bride. Sad Edna. Once she meets Listerine, of course, her problems will be solved. And what happens is that through this ad campaign, Listerine's sales skyrocket. They just take off. And the campaign is so successful among women that they come out the next year with Sad Marvin. After all, they want to be gender inclusive. Not really. But instead, this launches, not only does it do well for Listerine, but it launches, of course, a whole series of ads that, particularly when it comes to the female demographic of the audience, focuses incessantly on physical appearance and creates this sense that somehow no one is perfect. And it's not only women, but it's certainly been focused on women. And the quick testimony of this is anytime you're in a crowd, simply ask, how many people here feel great about their appearance and their physical body? Raise your hand. And so few of us are able to even imagine doing that in public. That is the triumph of this tyranny of inadequacy. So focused often with women on physical appearance or beauty. With men, it's more about objects or power or strength. It's around shortly after this time where the idea of a model comes out. It used to be you'd buy a car and you'd drive it for a long time. And when that sales began to plateau, they realized that if they just changed one or two features each year, they could call it a new model. And that would create in you the expectation that you were somehow missing out, that your car was no longer adequate to your needs. And what's striking, I think, about these ads, again, is the copy. So this one reads, when you first drive up in a Cadillac, your old friends will see you in a new light, as the you were always meant to be. And so Cadillac and the other companies come along and come out with model after model after model. I love this last one, just the sheer chutzpah of the marketers, the Cadillac worth. You could buy a new Cadillac for less than the cost of 11 other cars that are less worthy. The heart of inadequacy marketing are three things, the three-legged stool of inadequacy. Greed, you do not have enough. Fear, you are not safe enough. Insecurity, you are not attractive enough. And guess what? When you are caught in the grips of greed, fear, and insecurity, it is very hard to stray anywhere from the center. There is a kind of a psychological guru behind inadequacy marketing, and that is Sigmund Freud, whose creation of the idea of an unconscious. What is the unconscious? It's the place where all our unmet needs are expressed. And that if we pay attention to the unconscious, we will be able to identify those needs and have them met. So at the heart of Freud's own psychology is this conviction, you are not enough, you do not have enough, and we continue then to operate out of that in marketing and in so much of our world ever since. So here's the thing, as I mentioned before, our world is still dominated by a worldview of scarcity. There is not enough. And here's where I want to venture into the musings that some may or may not think are heretical. I want to wonder with you if whether our church has also been dominated by a worldview and even a theology of scarcity, that there is somehow never, ever enough. So, right, you're warned. This is where we're treading into more dubious ground, because I think we've all too often fallen prey to a theology of inadequacy and have built our theologies and our preaching and our teaching around a theology of lack. Brian McLaren, Rob Bell, two of the people who are leading the emergent Christian movement, have both suggested that you can see this simply in the way we've constructed our summary of the Christian story. McLaren calls it the six-line biblical narrative. Eden's mentioned just in passing, but really the story gets started around the fall, when we fall into that state of lack and then live with the threat of condemnation hanging over us. And then the decisive moment comes when we're offered a choice, a decision, whether to be restored to salvation in heaven or whether we will forever live in that situation of lack, of hell and damnation. Rob Bell's the one who wants to say, have you ever noticed that most of our theology ignores the first two chapters of the Bible? We go immediately to Genesis 3, that somehow that becomes paradigmatic for the whole of the story. And behind all of our lifting up of original sin, it seems like we've forgotten the entire notion of blessing or God's original blessing. So inadequacy theology, where you are not enough, I don't think we can blame this one on Freud. It's been around a little longer than he is. I'm tempted to blame it on Anselm. Anselm's the dude that I kind of look forward to meeting in heaven, having a little conversation, maybe a beer, and then popping him in the jaw. It's just me. You may feel differently. Or maybe it's our misreading of Anselm, but I think if it's not Anselm, it might even be Augustine. This constant sense of sin as lack, and that being the defining character of the human condition. You are not enough is the way we define sin. When we talk about grace, it's something that you don't have enough of. And I think for me, what gets kind of interesting or curious to play with is that what ties inadequacy marketing to inadequacy theology, what holds these both together is behind each of them rests an economic worldview, a worldview that's dominated by counting and measuring up. The worldview that's constantly thinking about checks and credits and debits. And whether you call it risk or reward, debit or credit, grace or sin, you never escape the constant sense of needing to measure and that relentless pressure to see if, in fact, there is enough. And the more you are caught up in that sense of measuring everything, then that again makes the thought of moving out from the center to the edge absolutely terrifying. So my question, the one I kind of keep thinking about, playing with some of this, is how do we as faith communities resist the cultural stories and even the popular theology of inadequacy? How, that is, do we avoid becoming Jonah? And I think the challenge or the task before us is to tell a better story than the one that's being offered. Now, I started the overview kind of delving into inadequacy through the world of marketing, and I want to go back to the world of marketing because it's been kind of interesting to see the culture paying attention to some of the themes I'd invite us to pay attention to as well. So we ended with that kind of the triumph of inadequacy marketing, constantly preying upon our insecurities, inviting us always to have more, to buy more, to get bigger. And that's incredibly successful about 40 or 50 years. And then in the 60s, and if you ever watched Mad Men, there was this kind of interesting scene in one of the seasons. There's this small, quiet, but really interesting counter movement. And you can kind of see it when this was the ad that dominated so much of the print and media press for some time, and then all of a sudden, out of the blue, comes a kind of countercultural ad. And it's Volkswagen. And there's a way in which what Volkswagen is trying to do is establish a different kind of relationship with the reader or hearer its market. It's not suddenly playing upon your insecurity or inviting you to imagine that you really won't be a woman until you look a certain way or a man until you drive so many horsepower. But instead, there's kind of a wink. There's kind of an invitation. Volkswagen, in a sense, is trying to say, oh, come on. You're smarter than that, aren't you? You're not going to be taken in by Cadillac's ads. Instead of always imagine going big, think small. This kind of invitation to a whole different worldview that's not dominated by a sense of lack or that bigger is better. And this ad launches this, to this day, relatively minor, the Minority Report way of thinking about marketing, which became called over time empowerment marketing. Because the key to this kind of advertising, of course, is the invitation, the tacitly spoken message to the viewer that you have enough. You don't need a big car to make you feel adequate. You can be just fine. So think small. You're smarter. You have everything you need. And the counterpunch, of course, across this is that instead of it being greed, you don't have enough, fear, you aren't safe enough, insecurity, you're not attractive enough, empowerment marketing moves in the other direction, instead inviting us to imagine love. You are enough. Contentment. You have enough. Possibility. You can. So back to Jonah. The climax of the story again, when Jonah has gone out to a different kind of edge, hoping against hope that God will relent in being forgiving. And what God does here is so fascinating. So he has this kind of moment of displeasure, of whining about what hasn't happened. And then he's so disappointed, so distraught that God is bigger than he thought, that God cannot be contained by his box, that God's love is more abounding than he imagined, that he cannot remain in the center because there is no center or boundary in God's love, that then he gets to the point where he's willing to say in his bitterness and smallness, "And now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die in the world I know than live in the world you're imagining." And the Lord says to him, "Really? Is it right for you to be this angry?" And Jonah, of course, thinks that it is. And so the story goes on. This kind of ridiculous, comic tragedy story goes on, so that the God then appoints a bush, because after all, Jonah's sitting out on the scorching heat, waiting to see if Nineveh will be spared, or maybe God will relent from relenting and destroy Nineveh as he hopes. And it's hot out there, so God grows a bush and gives him shade. And I just think the author's brilliant here. Jonah was so glad that there was a bush to ease his comfort. But then the bush itself dies. God prepares a worm, and Jonah says once again, "It is better for me to die than to live." And God asks Jonah this really interesting question at this point. Is it right, Jonah, for you to be angry about the bush? And we know Jonah's answer, yes. It is. Angry enough, actually, to die. Like this, there's just this 3-year-old quality of Jonah who just knows what he wants, and he wants it, and he's not going to let anyone deter him or imagine that there's a bigger, better world out there. He's so caught up. And then God's response, I think, is so powerful and curious and wondrous, and it's the only book in the Bible that ends with a question. Okay, Jonah, if you're that angry about the bush, angry enough to die, should I then not also be concerned about Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 people who do not know their right hand from their left? And I love this last part. And many animals. No one's excluded from this vision of grace. No one's excluded from this whole other world that God invites Jonah, and through Jonah, Israel, and through Israel's testimony, us to imagine. So that's the worldview of scarcity and adequacy. You do not have enough, you are not enough. The pillars are greed, fear, and insecurity. As I mentioned, Freud was kind of the psychological powerhouse behind that whole worldview. Around the same time, in fact, what gives spur to the move in marketing to turn to greater empowerment was another psychologist who had been trained in the ways of Freud and finally felt them insufficient to the needs of the day, and that was a guy by the name of Abraham Maslow. Maslow articulates a counterpoint to Freud in the middle of the century, post-World War II, when suddenly this view of scarcity and the extent or the degree to which we would do to hold on to power and stay at the center, the whole world kind of realized it was simply not a sustainable stance to take. And absent, in counterpoint to Freud's theology of lack, or psychology of lack, Maslow instead, and you probably remember this from your sophomore psychology class, Maslow invents what he describes as a hierarchy of needs. And he distinguishes between two kinds of needs in particular. Deficit needs, recognizing that there are, in fact, physical demands upon us, and there are in many various ways in which we lack, and we need to have those kinds of needs satisfied, of material, physical, safety, and food, and lodging. But then Maslow realizes that there's this other higher end, and he doesn't mean higher superior, but that you can only move to this other dimension of being human when, in fact, the physical needs have been met. And that is what he describes as being needs, of being accepted, of being loved, of being called to something bigger than you, of being granted a purpose. and a chance to make a difference. And from Maslow's pioneering work stems the psychology of what's called actualization and empowerment. And again, I'm kind of curious to think about the degree to which we might think about a theology of actualization and empowerment as a counterpoint to the dominant popular theology of lack. And so what I want to kind of play with is, what would a theology of empowerment look like? And my hope in kind of playing with or exploring some of these cultural strands is not so much that the culture teaches us theology, but that the culture awakens us to some of our own habits and penchants and tendencies and asks questions that maybe we stopped asking a little while ago, and invites us to frame a question. Tillich would always say, the culture asks the questions. Theology invites us to wrestle with answers. So I'm curious, given the kind of dominance, in particularly in a conservative Protestant-dominated religious imagination, what would a theology of empowerment as opposed to a theology of lack look like? And for me, what's always interesting is to think about the four Gospels, but particularly narratively, to always know as a lover of stories that first things in stories really matter. And although the Gospels tell a similar story, they differ, of course, at different points. And one of those points is the beginning. Each of them offers a different account of the opening of Jesus' ministry. And I think that we are invited by each evangelist to pay attention to what is it that Jesus does first, and to imagine that will signal for us something of the theme and the confession of each gospel distinctly. And so when you look at Matthew, the first public thing Jesus does is to bless, and to bless the crowds, and to call those blessed who are so rarely in that world called blessed. Those who are poor in spirit, those who are hungry, those who mourn, those who are least of these. The first public activity of Jesus is to offer blessing to those the world does not imagine deserve blessing. In Mark, the first thing Jesus does is an exorcism. He casts out a demon and signals through this one of Mark's themes that Jesus comes to stand against all the forces of the world that would rob the children of God of the life God imagined for them. In Luke, the first thing he does is preach a sermon. You gotta love Luke. But he preaches a sermon about release. He preaches a sermon about freedom. He preaches a sermon saying that the day of the Lord, one of the release of the captives and sight to the blind and the ability to walk and run to those who have been lame, that this new day is here. And in John, of course, the first public act is a really peculiar miracle when you think about it. As if the Son of God, in the face of all of human need, has nothing better to do than make sure that the wine doesn't stop flowing at a wedding. And of course, it's not just wine, it's blessing. And when that couple runs out of wine, they are bereft of blessing. And there is Jesus on the scene to make manifest and abundant of blessing. Blessing, exorcism, release, abundance. Each of the Gospels begins with a different take on the character and quality of what Jesus has called the gift of abundant life. John 10, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life, but not just life, and certainly not just existence or even perseverance, but life in its abundance. So again, what would a theology of empowerment look like? Or maybe, to call it or name it in language more of our own familiarity, what would a theology of abundant life look like? Maybe in this way, sin wouldn't be simply something that you are not enough, but sin is a force, it's a power, it's at work in the world, according to the Apostle Paul. Sin is whatever it is that keeps us from the promise and reality of God's abundant life. And grace might be more than making up a deficit. Grace might be more than somehow God's divine whiteout, right, to all the checks St. Peter has been keeping. Maybe grace is God's empowerment to seize and live into and share the promise of abundant life. The John passage, I think, is so helpful because in John 10, Jesus makes two moves. And the first is what a deconstructive move. It is the move of critique. Anyone who does not enter by the sheepfold by the gate, but climbs in by another way is a thief and a bandit, and make no mistake, thieves and bandits come for one reason only, to kill and rob and steal and destroy. And there are so many cultural images and messages that seek to do just that, and far too often the church has rode on that bandwagon. And after the deconstructive, the constructive move, I came that they might have life and have it abundantly. So again, this question that I think is the pressing one for us going forward, what would a theology of abundant life look like? What would a message or theology or homiletic or church or congregational life of abundance that created the kind of confidence and joy and hope that invited us to move out from the center and to move to the edge where we always encounter God? I've come that they might have life and have it abundantly. So what I want to think about, again, a little bit is how do we construct this worldview of abundance? And the three things I want to imagine now: instead of greed, contentment, you have enough. Instead of fear, possibility, you can do all things to the one who strengthens you. Instead of insecurity, acceptance, you are enough. And again, I'm going to borrow from culture. Not to have culture tell us what our theology is, but I think it's really curious to, again, listen to what the culture is saying or noticing or paying attention to. And so to these three messages, I want to pair three commercials, really. Three strands or examples of the still minority report of empowerment marketing. And just notice for a moment the power of the message or the effect that the message has on you. Now, I know each of these is a commercial, and so at the end, you're going to end up with a product. And it's trying to sell something. I'm not trying to whitewash the act of marketing as anything other than trying to sell us products. But I do want to think about the difference of the impact of an ad of empowerment versus an ad of scarcity. So the ad, the commercial works because it plays upon the stereotype that the marketing inadequacy has created in us. The most distrusted age cohort in the United States today is our teenagers. There's across the board, surveys demonstrate that's the group that we're most not anxious for, but anxious about. And it sucks you into that because you know as you watch he's up to no good. And his mother's pretty sure he's up to no good. And then the turn is to invite you to imagine that you are something more. That finally contentment is not about having everything you want, it's about recognizing who you are. And the Christian story, I think, has a lot to say about that too. So paired with the three commercials, I want to pull from three stories of the edge in the Gospels. and invite us to think about some of the resources of our narrative to construct a theology and worldview of abundant life. The first one I want to go to is from John 4, the Samaritan woman at the well. And the thing that always strikes me about the story is nowhere in the story does Jesus accuse the woman of being a sinner. Nowhere in the story does he offer her forgiveness. Those issues aren't raised at all, and yet the history of Christian proclamation on this text is that she is obviously a wanton woman who has had 5 husbands and is living with someone who's not. What if rather than being a whore, she is tragic and has been a part of the custom of levirate marriage, where she has had husband after husband die and given to one after another until she's absolutely desperate. There is no mention in the entire text of her sin or of Jesus offering forgiveness. And yet somehow, out of our own kind of worldview of lack, we assume that's the problem. When maybe what the issue is that she has not yet met anyone to tell her who she really is, which is her own stunning line, "Come and meet someone that has told me everything I've ever done." So when the disciples come back, I think this is so interesting after the long exchange with the woman at the well. They are astonished that he was speaking with a woman. But no one said, "What do you want?" or "Why are you speaking with her?" Because intuitively they realized they had stumbled upon a holy scene and that something had changed, and they had been invited for a moment to step into this other kingdom. And then, having been told who she really is, the woman left her water jar and went back to the city. Contentment is not about what you have, it's who you are. And our message to the world is to tell people that they are, each and every one, children of God, beloved from the foundations of the world. Second message, first with a commercial, then with a text. Possibility. Fear does not have to have the last word.
There are man-eating sharks in every ocean, but we still swim. Every second, somewhere in the world, lightning strikes, but we still play in the rain. Poisonous snakes can be found in 49 of the 50 states, but we still go looking for adventure. A car can crash, a house can crumble, but we still drive and love coming home. Because I think deep down we know all the bad things that can happen in life, they can't stop us from making our lives good.
All right, I get it. It's a commercial. It's Allstate. The first time I happened to use this clip was with a congregation not too long ago, and on the way out came a gentleman who said, he said, "You know, I work for Allstate." And he said that theme that we came up with a year or two ago is changing the way we do everything. Which I thought was just really interesting. The power of empowering words, even when they come just from the culture. So a text. I love this text from Matthew with the centurion who has a beloved slave who is ill and comes to Jesus and beseeches him to heal the centurion. And the centurion says, "Look, I'm not worthy to have you come into my house. Don't bother. But I know what authority is." And so says to Jesus, "Just say the word, and he will be healed." And then Jesus' response is not to ask him to convert to Judaism or to a nascent Christianity, or to ask him about if he knows the 4 spiritual laws, or whether he has given his heart to God. Jesus just heals and commends his faith, which is this really interesting kind of interreligious dialogue happening that I think we almost entirely gloss over. But here, this one, the Roman centurion who does not profess anything remotely like the faith of Jesus and his disciples is commended as one of having more faith than he has found anywhere else in Israel. And that faith comes from this kind of confidence about a possibility that when you are in the presence of the God who created light out of darkness and raised Jesus Christ from the dead, then suddenly anything is possible. Third element of a theology of abundant life, it's acceptance. Maybe part of the message of acceptance is to remind each other it's not about us as individuals, it's about us collectively, and the gift of identity that God confers on us. So again, commercial and then text.
Dedication. Loyalty. Friendship. The choices we make reveal the true nature of our character.
All right, again, I get it. It's a commercial. But I kind of love that it's Guinness. First time I saw this commercial, it was, I think, 2 summers ago. When was the last Summer Games? Whatever the last Summer Games was, a year or 2 years ago. And I was like, oh, well, that's kind of cool. There's been a lot of attention to the Paralympics, and that's another neat commercial of what you can do that can't be held back. And then I was just kind of struck, really surprised, when you realize, of course, that it's not about handicap, it's about solidarity. It's about seeing identity differently. It's not about what one person has or lacks, but about who all of us are together. And again, stories there. And the story that, for me, that sense of surprise about things that you do not expect to happen, for me, is the story of the Syrophoenician woman, or in Matthew, the Canaanite woman, which is a really great name because there had probably been no one who had lived in that region for hundreds of years that were called Canaanites. But I don't know if it's Matthew signaling kind of this kind of rupture. Not only is Jesus on the edge, literally beyond the boundaries of where he should be, but also the sense of this rupture of time. Moving beyond our ordinary time. The woman comes and kneels before him in the posture of worship and begs him to heal his daughter. And then I think one of the most difficult lines in Scripture, and it's harder because it's in a couple of the Gospels, where Jesus, like our Jesus, our good and loving Jesus, calls her a dog. And we tend in our interpretation to want to soften that and say, well, really, in the Greek, it's the word for a small dog. So he's not really saying, you dog. He's more saying, oh, you cute little puppy. I'm thinking that's not the way she heard it. It is, you dog. And then in response, this kind of unrelenting persistence, a refusal of that worldly identity and this demand, or actually the acceptance of that identity on behalf of a larger cause, the sake of her daughter. And then the commendation from Jesus, woman, great is your faith. And the question that I wrestle with now when I read this passage, and it took me a long time, I think, even to be able to ask myself the question, does Jesus change here? Does Jesus grow? Does this woman, in her persistence for the sake of another, teach the teacher? Is even Jesus in a process in the story of Mark of this expansion of his own sense of the breadth of his ministry, and the unlimitless of God's grace. This story surprises also, and the surprise is that no one in the story, not even Jesus, can define the limits of who God accepts. It's all of us, no matter what. So this worldview of abundance then, instead of greed, contentment, you have enough. Instead of fear, possibility, you can do all things. Instead of insecurity, acceptance, you are enough. Now, the question you may be thinking is the one that I think about habitually or have been trained to think, well, what about sin, right? I mean, here I am talking about all this like empowerment and actualization stuff, and it sounds so damn new agey. Aren't we really about sin? And I think what I've come to the place of just wanting to say again and again is that despite the way the popular culture has constructed the Christian message, or the way some of those in the church have offered the Christian message, finally what Christians have to offer is not simply insight into sin. I mean, it's got to be, of all of our theological claims, it's got to be the easiest one to prove. I mean, pick up the freaking newspaper. Turn on the news. Everywhere you look, there's manifest evidence of the brokenness of humanity and our need and our sin. That cannot be our central claim. What we offer is not insight into sin, but the very possibility of forgiveness, which is the scarce word, the solitary word. But I've been curious again to notice that the culture has begun to be speaking this word in a way that I don't remember from earlier. This past board meeting, I had a little bit of break. One of the board members asked me what I do with my free time, and I said, I can't remember. No, what I said was, lately, for years, we never watched much TV in our household. When our kids were first born, in part because of our own kind of, I didn't name it this way, but my own awareness of that kind of avalanche of messages of insecurity and inadequacy, we just went off the grid cable-wise and didn't watch. It wasn't the content of the TV that shows we were worried about with our kids, it was the commercials. And I said, but recently I keep hearing about all the great TV there is, and so I've just started, I bought a rowing machine, and I've been rowing and watching TV, and kind of two birds with one stone, and all these great shows. And then he said, well, what do you watch? It's like, well, it's all over the place, like Downton Abbey, or Sherlock, or True Detective, and then I made he said, what's your favorite? And I made the big mistake of the board meeting. I said, The Walking Dead. And I got this kind of look of absolute horror and dismay. And then worse, the line that came from this beloved friend and board member, that surprises me. Which was kind of like as a kid when I screwed up and my parents didn't get mad or get angry or dole out punishment. They just said, David, we're disappointed in you. So I started explaining and, defending myself. And if you've watched more than the first couple episodes, you know what I'm talking about. And if not, it's just not going to work. But I've been struck by, in the show, by the way, that is so popular, not only does it command the attention of viewers and critics alike, but after the show airs on AMC each Sunday, then there is one whole additional hour called The Talking Dead, where it's a live show with the host and a couple of the cast members, a small audience, and people tweeting and emailing in, where the show has been compelling enough that it commands another huge viewership of people who want to talk about this story. This story that finally, in case you're wondering, isn't really about zombies, but about what it is to be human, and what it is to be human in situations of extremity. And why is it that when things are difficult, some people rise to new heights and other people fall? And how far down the road can you go and not yet come back? And again in the most recent seasons, the primary question is, can we forgive? Can we forgive each other? And as I was struck kind of by watching that, it occurred to me that some of the other or other shows that I've watched with my kids, shows as varied as The 100 or Arrow, also have at the core of these stories the power and possibility, the question of, is forgiveness possible? And what happens when one person extends it to another? And it's as if this larger culture that's now delving into the longer sense of narrative. It's moved from episodes to telling a story over seasons, is becoming aware of its kind of the false promise of the culture itself, and recognizing that beneath all of the other things, there is the absolute need and recognition for the possibility of forgiveness. And I watch it, and I'm kind of instructed and inspired, but I'm also just a little annoyed, because I'm like, look, we've got this story in spades, and we need to tell it. We need to invite people into something bigger than what their world has too often invited them to. Forgiveness, finally, is not about the past. It is about releasing the past so that there may be a future. And the cross, damn it, is not a mechanism that makes it possible for God to love and forgive us. The cross is testimony to just how much God already loves us. So, again, to Jesus, I came that they might have life and have it abundantly, and just in case Jesus isn't good enough for you, a few words from Luther. I love the becoming quote, and I'm sure you've read it before. So if we can imagine that part of our task at this particular time, that part of the task of the church, of the teaching theologians of the church, which are the leaders of our congregations, is to always be paying attention to the questions the culture is asking and offer an answer that is as faithful to the tradition as it is fitting to the time. If that question before us is, how might we imagine a theology of abundant life? Then the question that comes from that is, what does a congregation of abundance look like? What does a community that's taken that message seriously feel like, and what is that experience? And I think the honest question is, as it is any time we venture into kind of a new territory or terrain or new framing of the Christian story, is we don't entirely know. We haven't figured out what it is to be church in this new era or world. That not knowing, though, does not have to terrify us. It does not have to paralyze us, because we have hunches. We have hunches from our tradition and from our experience and from our conversations with each other. And I think one of the things that I hope happens during events like this is not only we catch up with family and work and friends, but we also take time to share, like, what's going on in our congregations, what's working, what's not working, where are we experimented, what have we learned, what are we trying, as we figure it out together. One of the hunches that I have, again, is that our call is to tell a better story and to be aware particularly of the cultural story of inadequacy, the one that judges us or invites us to esteem ourselves and others entirely on these superficial terms, and finally views us as nothing more than the potential consumer of a product, and instead invite the people of this culture who have been formed in this shrunken worldview to a different vision, one where God calls us blessed and beloved from the very beginning. And this idea of telling a better story, for me, one of the elements of literature that's really shaped my own imagination around this is a couple pieces of Greek mythology. When I think about the cultural messages, this is the reason we didn't have our kids watching TV for so long until they got old enough to talk about it. When I think about those messages, I often am reminded of the Greek myths about the sirens. Right? You'll remember the sirens are the ones who sometimes are portrayed as beautiful women, sometimes as these kind of scary harpies, but either way, it's like the dominant theme is that they sing a song more beautiful than any other song. And that they are surrounding this island that's surrounded by rocky shoals, and what they'll do is sing a song, and as the sailors go by, they can't help but row toward the source of that song and eventually founder on the shoals and come to their death. Now, there are two stories in particular in Greek mythology that have kind of a climactic moment around the engagement of the myth of the sirens. And the one is the one we probably know better, which is the story of Odysseus. And Odysseus is on his way back from the Trojan War, and he's been forewarned of the sirens. So he knows of his peril, but he also wants to hear and experience that song for himself. And so he does two things. First, he makes sure he stuffs all of the ears of his crew with beeswax so they can't hear the song themselves. And then he has them lash him to the mast so that no matter how insanely driven he is to hear that song, he can't throw himself off the ship or try to alter the course. And I think that's one option which we have exercised at times and maybe need to exercise, which is to try and filter out the cultural messages, to invite our families and our congregation members, in particular our kids, to have a break from that overwhelming avalanche of inadequate messages. And it's, that's what we did with our kids. We didn't have a TV there. It was another way of kind of stuffing their ears with beeswax. But whatever that might be for a temporary need or response, it's finally not adequate. Eventually they grow up. They leave the house. We go out in the world. These messages are unavoidable. The Odysseus option is temporary at best, but will not suffice. And so the second story, the one we don't know quite as well, is the story of Orpheus. Orpheus is the father of music and often is portrayed in art with a lyre. And the story that he's figuring into just now is the story of Jason and the Argonauts. You might remember Jason and the Argonauts are sent to chase the golden fleece, and the golden fleece is that mantle that when you put it on anyone, you are instantly healed. And so just before they're going to go, Jason is told by the Oracle of Delphi to bring with him Orpheus. And he has no idea why. But he does know that when the Oracle of Delphi tells you to do something, it's a good idea to listen. So he brings Orpheus along, who seems more or less useless on their adventures until, that is, they venture near the Sirens and are caught at unawares and unprepared. And the whole of the ship, like so many other ships before them, turned course and veered toward the rocky shoals and toward their death. And at that moment, the wisdom of the Oracle of Delphi is revealed, because Orpheus takes out his lyre and he steps to the prow of the ship and he plays a better song. He plays a more beautiful song and guides his sailors to life. What a great image that is for the church, that we're invited to tell a better story and to sing a better song. That the issue isn't about scolding people for the stories they run after, but rather to ask them at those moments that life invites, is that story sufficient for the weight of meaning and purpose and acceptance you need? And in those moments to offer humbly and vulnerably a better story and to sing a better song. If we can redefine church in light of abundance, then maybe church is the place that we go to remind each other of that better story. The story that God created us and loves us and wants us to know contentment and possibility and acceptance even now, as well as in the life to come. Church is not the refuge of the damned or the hideout of the holy. It is the home and practice ground of those who believe that there is something more than what we've been offered. And preaching, because I can't help talking a little bit about preaching, might just be the invitation to that more, the means to name the thieves and the bandits in order to invite abundant life. Preaching, finally, is about making a promise that God has called you worthy of love and dignity, that God wants for you and for all people abundant life, and that God has planned and promised to use you to extend that life to others. Which brings us back just a little longer to the story of Jonah. Again, Jonah is on the edge. He's been on the edge from the very first moment that God called him to a different reality than he'd imagined. And he's also on the edge of that city, angry enough to die, when God asks this question again that is not answered in the story. Should I not also be concerned about Nineveh, that great city of more than 120,000 people who do not know their left hand from the right, and also all those animals? The only book in the Bible that ends in a question meant, I think, to prompt an answer from the readers, from us. Yeah, God, you should. And so should we. What does a congregation of abundance look like? We don't know for sure, and going to the edge can be frightening, That's the whole point of edges, but whenever I think that way or begin to feel anxious about where my own theology or wandering or musings is leading me, whether it's God or someone else who's taking me ahead, I am helped by being reminded that the earliest Christians weren't called Christians. Do you remember what they were called? They were called people of the way. I love that. People of the way. People were invited to follow in the way of Jesus. People who were invited to do something, to be something different. People of the way and people on the way. People who knew they did not have it all figured out. The stunning thing about the Gospels, even in the resurrection accounts, is how different they are, how distinctive they are, how each one has a different emphasis, a different particular confession, and yet the one thing on which there is absolute unanimity across the four Gospels is that nobody expected Jesus to come back. Nobody believed the word of resurrection. The people who were closest to Jesus, who had ministered with him for years, who had heard his predictions, who knew him better than anyone else, nevertheless dismissed the word of resurrection as an idle and ridiculous tale. It took them time to figure out what it meant to be people of the way. It will take us time too. We know that sometimes that way will be gentle and beautiful and pastoral like the winding roads in the Brandywine River Valley. And sometimes it won't. But either way, we know that it's Jesus who is calling us and God who is leading us to the edge. And in that spirit, in that hope, and in that confidence, I'd ask you to close with me by praying that prayer of matins of the morning. Lord God, have called your servants to ventures of which we cannot see the ending, by paths as yet untrodden, through perils unknown. Give us faith to go out with good courage, not knowing where we go, but only that your hand is leading us and your love supporting us, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.